Chris, put your phone down and stop WhatsApping Rishi Sunak or whoever it is.
No, I was yeah, good point.
Do some self-promotion?
Yeah, it was actually, yeah, guilty as charged.
So in this episode of Newscast, we've got the world premiere of the Newscast Christmas advert. So the words were crowdsourced from Newscast listeners.
Yes.
The music has been provided by the Grammy Award-winning King Singers, who sent us this from their tour in Japan. Here's a little snippet.
On the first day of Christmas, Newscast explained to me on a podcast on BBC Sounds. On the second day of Christmas, Newscast explained to me two heads of state on a podcast on BBC Sounds. On the third day of Christmas, Newscast explained to me 3 p.m. two heads of state on a podcast on BBC Sounds. On the fourth day of Christmas, Newscast explained to me.
Pretty good, eh?
That is pretty good.
And you will feel even more Christmassy by the end of today's episode, because we're going to play a whole lot more of it on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And Chris in the studio.
And we're going to be joined by some other very well-known political journalists in a bit to chew over what a momentous year it's been. But it's actually been a pretty momentous day in the NHS, because nurses have gone on strike in a lot of England, a lot of Wales and Northern Ireland in this dispute over pay. Not in Scotland, because it seems to have been settled there. And I suppose this is in the context of, well, everyone knows, a load of strikes everywhere.
Yeah, Royal College of Nursing in Scotland still working out what they're going to do there. Yeah, I kind of think today really is sort of the biggest moment yet in this winter of industrial action, because even though it's in pockets and perhaps not as extensive geographically as, say, the rail strikes have been, it's nurses, and on a scale that we've not seen before. And with the prospect as we head into the new year of all sorts of other sectors that are still in the balloting process or not even got to the balloting process yet, potentially strikes in lots of the teaching unions and the firefighters and civil servants. And then that sense of what does the government do? And to be honest, at the moment, they're scrabbling around, particularly around mitigation. They are more worried about the ambulance service strikes in most of England and Wales coming next Wednesday in terms of the potential dangers that poses to patients. And as things stand, no real prospect of a kind of breakthrough on either side. The standoff remains.
And we can zoom into what the dispute with the nurses means with the health editor for the Sunday Times, Sean Linton, who is here. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Adam.
So do we know how much disruption has been caused to kind of the normal level of care as a result of this strike?
So I think the estimates are still coming in. We're still hearing from people around the country, but the ministers have suggested around 70,000 appointments for patients have been affected by today's strikes, which is a small number when you consider the total backlog for the NHS is 7.2 million now. But for those patients, this was a major disruption to them, and it could take several weeks for new dates to be supplied to those patients. So, for those people, it's hugely disruptive.
And we should remind people that there's quite large areas of England where there was no strike action at all, because in those particular trusts, they didn't reach the threshold for strike action to take place.
Yeah, that's true. Very roughly, there are around 200 NHS trusts in England. Very roughly, just over half actually met the threshold and voted for strike. And even with that level, the RCN actually have chosen a much smaller number of trusts to actually take part in today's action. So, in all seriousness, I think the best way of kind of thinking about today from the RCN's perspective, it's kind of like an opening salvo in their battle with the government. And, you've heard the RCN say quite clearly they want negotiations, and we haven't seen ministers willing to do that yet. And I think inevitably that means the RCN, having started quite slowly and with an approach that is prioritizing patient safety and patient care, they are going to ramp that up, I think. And they've already warned in the new year we could see further strikes. And, that opens up the question of what exactly will it take to get ministers to the table to discuss pay. I think it's starting to look unreasonable for ministers to just hold the position of no discussion whatsoever on pay, because I think all that's going to really lead to is more damaging strikes, and inevitably other unions in the health service are about to join as well. We've got an ambulance strike taking place next week, so I'm not sure the government's hard line at the moment will hold.
Sean, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Chris, for the next part of this episode, we have to put on our Christmas jumpers. So
do we?
headphones off.
Okay, all right. Jacket off.
You look really cute.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Right, so we're now going to have a bit of a pre-Christmas end-of-year vibe, and we've now got the three wise political editors. Chris Mason, who's rapidly getting his Christmas jumper on.
This thing flashes, you know. I can flash.
Oh,
Okay,
come
I look
on.
forward to
so
that.
to speak. The battery's
Careful.
flat, though, so...
Also, Beth Rigby from Sky
All of our
News.
batteries are flat
Hello.
after this year.
And Robert Peston from ITV.
Hello, and obviously people were too scared to send me the Christmas jumper memo. So I haven't
It's
got
quite alpine, that jumper, though.
I think it's just that Robert's too suave.
No.
Well, I don't
tighter
think
than
he's
the
got a
other-
Christmas jumper. Do you?
No, but I would have had to procure one just to, you know.
How you were making a joke about your batteries needing recharged, Beth.
Yeah.
What are your battery levels after this year?
I think they're red.
Low.
They're low.
Yeah, I'm thinking that battery advert with the excitable pink bunnies and
Yeah.
the ears for me going...
Yeah. What, like we started like Duracell bunnies and we ended...
sort of
What
tipped
did
on
we
their
end
side.
at?
I don't know. We're definitely Jackson Brown running on empty, aren't we?
Robert, I was going to say you've been around these parts longer than most of us because you've had a few stints here.
Make some ageist remarks. Yes.
No,
Still looking good,
experience,
Robert.
Experience. Put the events of this year in context of other mad years.
Like nothing I've experienced, lived through, worked through. On my way over, I was comparing it to the other most mad time in my professional life, which was 2007, 2008. I've done sort of two biggest strands in my career, business, economics and politics.
Yeah.
And this has been essentially the equivalent of the great banking crisis, great financial crisis for politics. 3 prime ministers in 2 months, partygate. I mean, in a way, I sort of feel we have to go back to what many Tories, refer to as the Opaz affair, because it's sort of, that's really when the madness kicks off, when Boris Johnson tries to, break all parliamentary privilege by protecting his mate Owen Paterson from being sanctioned by the House of Commons, and then it's just got crazier and crazier and crazier and crazier, and we're all exhausted.
Do you know as well, I was actually, because this is the week where we all sat in the studios and Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority. And I remember...
3 years ago.
Yeah, this week.
Yeah.
And I remember coming back in January and saying to my editor, it's politics is going to be... I mean, I know it's Boris Johnson, but it's going to be pretty dull. I mean, he's got an 80-seat majority.
Yeah.
I know.
I nearly
just be
gave up.
sacked, shouldn't I?
I nearly gave up reporting Westminster
Yeah.
in the January of 2020.
We didn't know that.
That would have been terrible.
Just after the election, because I thought, you know what, we've had this extraordinary period. We've had the independence referendum, we've had general elections every 45 minutes, we've had Brexit, we've had all of the rows around Brexit, we've had a general election campaign in the depths of winter, and then an 80-seat majority. So jeopardy's left the building. So maybe it's time to go and find another patch.
Gardening.
And then
not literally.
another news patch, another news patch.
So I think you committed news.
And then
He's
a month
committed
later, pandemic strikes.
Yeah.
And that rams home that the Brexit arguments were arguments and intense arguments, but it was about a battle of political ideas, wasn't it? How we're governed, not confining us to our homes, etc., etc. And then everything that's happened this year. It's extraordinary.
Just to pat
And they
myself
are all linked, of course.
Of course.
Yes.
And I think that the way that I think of it is you had these extraordinary, obviously health shock, but broadly an economic shock, which intensified because of some of the crazy mistakes that Truss and Kwarteng made. But then when you set that against the personality of the last but one, as it were, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who never followed the rules, that combination of economic shocks and, I think it would be to flatter him to call him a maverick, but somebody who, doesn't play by the normal rules, it was obviously going to be hugely unstable, and so it turned out to be.
Two things where I'm going to pat myself on the back. One, with the 80-seat majority. I remember coming in the next morning, having stayed up all night, going, guys, it's not really an 80-seat majority. It's the Tory party. So it's probably a majority of 20, and it will vary from issue to issue to issue. So don't sit back. Second of all, the Owen Paterson thing. I think I was there for the absolute Boris Johnson peak, which was the third day of COP26 in Glasgow, just as all the world leaders went home.
Yeah.
Boris Johnson's team
together.
were in their hotel, and they were all quaffing champagne, apparently, because they just felt that they'd had a whole series of victories. I wasn't in this hotel. And then I went home, got a call saying, on the Today programme tomorrow morning, you're going to be talking about this Owen Paterson thing, which I hadn't heard about until that night. And so I think that was the absolute turning point.
I think that's very astute, actually, very astute.
Oh, thank you so much.
And then, just another moment, not so much a turning point, but the bit where the skids properly kicked in. I remember when we got back, Beth, from the trip we'd been at the NATO summit in Madrid. Were you on that trip?
No, because do you remember, you could only do one bit.
Oh, and you'd been to the first leg in Rwanda.
I went to Rwanda,
that was
where
it.
the 2 by-election losses.
Yes.
And he had this press briefing where he got all the packing, and being Johnson and optimistic, should we say, or overconfident, if you like, he'd kind of gone, well, I don't just want to do one term or 2 terms, I want to do 3 terms.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
Oh my!
And I was like,
I remember that.
You've lost a couple of by-elections, and you're in a bit of bother back home. That might not be the right messaging. And I remember his press secretary trying to go, it was only joking. I was like, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. No. And that really agitated. And then off he went to Madrid.
And then off he went to Germany for the G7, and then on to Madrid for NATO. And obviously the questions from back home followed him. I remember asking him about the loss of support on the backbenches. But when a Prime Minister's abroad, they stand that bit taller, don't they, as compared with anyone else, because of the nature of the job. And then when I got back, I think it was a Thursday night, I went to my local kebab shop, and I'm stood in the queue.
What did you have?
And chicken shish.
Okay.
As soon as you ask. And I get a text, and it was the Sun, and it was Chris Pincher, former Deputy Chief Whip, and we were kicking around, do I need to come back and do the 10 o'clock news and blah, blah, blah. And that was then the final straw, wasn't it?
I hope you had your chicken shish.
I did. I absolutely did. I absolutely did.
Johnson was never happier, was he, than when he was on a trip abroad. He loved nothing more, did he, than being on the world stage.
I mean, very early on, I remember, I think it was going to America with him on, he hadn't been in the job very long. And I just said, how is it, the job? And he said, oh my God, it's better than I could possibly have dreamed of.
Did he say that in that slightly orgasmic way that you just did it there?
Yeah, no, I mean, and he absolutely loved it, which also obviously explains some of the other bits of madness this year, like him trying to come back really recently.
Yeah, but I wouldn't write off. I would not write off a Boris Johnson renaissance next year.
No. I mean, we can talk about that later. But nonetheless, trying to come back, after the Liz Truss debacle was not an example of great astuteness, shall we say.
Right, let's listen to you guys being very astute in your day jobs. Beth, this is you interviewing Boris Johnson back in the COVID era, because he's got a face mask on in a hospital, and this is just after some of the most kind of dramatic partygate revelations broke out. And here's the interview.
This is the first time we've seen you since reports emerged in the Daily Telegraph, not denied by Downing Street, about 2 boozy parties held in the garden in the buildings of Number 10 the night before Prince Philip's funeral, when the country was in national mourning. Was having to apologise to the Queen about those parties the night before she put her husband of over 70 years, she laid him to rest. Was that a moment of shame for you?
I deeply and bitterly regret that happened, and I can only and renew my apologies both to Her Majesty and to the country for misjudgments that were made, and for which I take full responsibility.
That was what we call in the trade a pool clip, isn't it? Where you're kind of interviewing him on behalf of everyone. And normally they're only like a couple of minutes, but you had him like a fish wriggling on a hook for hours.
That was an extraordinary moment in that we hadn't seen him for a while. And Dominic Cummings, the day before, I think, had made all these public allegations about Boris Johnson knew about these parties, he's lying. We also hadn't heard from him since all the revelations had emerged in the Daily Telegraph that there had been these parties in Downing Street the night before Prince Philip's funeral. So there was this wealth of material, really, that I had to put to him. And I remember thinking, well, what I'll do is I'll start off with Cummins. He'll do obfuscate, deny, like kick into the long grass, wait for Sue Grell, whatever. And then once we've done that, then I'm going to bring up the Queen, because then he cannot get out of this interview because he can't not answer the questions about the Queen. What surprised me was a couple of things. Number one, and I think it was a sign of the turmoil in Downing Street, normally those things are very carefully Matt, you know this and you know this. You know this as well. It's like someone's tapping your shoulder. Like
almost physically dragging you away.
Physically dragging you away after 3 or 4 questions. But somehow he wasn't able, there wasn't really anyone doing that, and he wasn't able to extricate himself from the room. So he was a bit stuck.
And that's interesting because simple things like that are a sign of things breaking
Yeah,
down. Because we know it's normally super slick.
We know how slick it is. And then the second thing that surprised me about that interview was just how he seemed in himself. Normally, you get lots of different versions of Boris Johnson when you're interviewing him, but what you don't normally ever see is contrition. And
it's the heavy breathing.
And the sort of the
breathing,
and I did actually think in that moment that he was struggling, and I wondered afterwards, was it because of the Dominic Cummings betrayal? That to have your closest advisor, it's like someone that knows all your secrets, telling the world your secrets because they want to try to destroy you. Had that actually begun to get to him? And did he think, they always call him the grease piglet, don't they? That whatever bind he was in, he could slip out and escape. And did he think that this was the moment where he couldn't find an exit route? I don't know.
Right, Chris, let's listen to the denouement of the Boris Johnson story, which was broken by you on the Today programme after you'd very rudely walked out of the Today programme to answer the phone. But I'm glad you did.
In fact, Michelle, as I speak to you, I'm getting a call from Downing Street. So I'm going to take this call and I'll come back on to you in just a second.
Chris, you take that call. Let me tell our listeners while you take the call that the Defence Secretary, Ben... Tobias, Elwood, forgive me. We're going to interrupt you because Chris Mason has news.
Yes. Chris, let's go straight back to you. You were just talking to Downing Street.
The Prime Minister has agreed to stand down. He has spoken to Sir Graham Brady, the chair of the Backbench 1922 committee, this morning and said that it is appropriate for him to stand down and for the party to pick a new leader in time for the party conference, that being at the beginning of October.
Yeah, what was that like, intoning those words? Did you practice it beforehand? Or did you
no, I didn't have time. I mean, I was incredibly lucky because... So I've been on the Today programme all morning basically saying... Nobody in Downing Street's picking up the phone. Abject failure of journalism. But by the end of 3 hours, we were able to say, well, look, I mean, this is a bit strange. I ended up sort of saying to the editor, I remember at one point saying, I think I'm just going to say, let's just show our workings here that the likes of Beth, Robert and I make these calls every morning. It's entirely standard, and you speak to the Labour Party and others as well, and they give you a sense of the day ahead and all that. And they might not pick the phone up straight away, but they might ring back half an hour later. Nothing for 3 hours, when the obvious question was, is he going to resign? So I said that I think it's reasonable that we can start saying it looks like there must be conversations going on. And if there aren't, I said, I'm going to say on the air, and if there aren't, if there's anyone listening in Downing Street and I'm wide of the mark, ring me up and tell me, and I'll come back on the radio and I'll say just that.
Perfect.
And then at 10 to 9, I said, look, something's going to happen. He's going to go. I don't want to be stuck in my back bedroom with my headphones on for much longer. I want to get to Downing Street. And they said, we're thinking of staying on until 10 o'clock. Should we? And I said, yes, as long as you're comfortable with the idea we might get to 10 o'clock and nothing still happened. But you should stay on. And then they said, we wanted you at 2 minutes to 9. Then, classic Today programme, they overran. I think it was Fraser Nelson was on and he overran. Well, will you stick around till 5 past? I said, go on then, I will, and then I'm going.
If you insist.
So at 5 past, I go on and say a version of what I've been saying all morning, which is that they're not answering the phone. Then the phone rings. And not physically rings, because I had it on silent, but I said, on the air, the phone's ringing. Took the call, was told, he's going to go. Then you think, right. And then one of those moments, which I suspect you don't get very often in a career, where I shout down the line, put me on the air. Get me on.
We've had those a few times, and it's a great sort of movie moment. It's the movie of the.
But what I love about that, if it had been any other day, you would have been maybe having to interrupt in our time and saying to Melvin Bragg, Stop talking about the
it just wouldn't have happened.
sack of Rome.
Or if I'd set off to work and
I know, been on the tube.
If I'd been on the air, on my phone, I wouldn't have been able to take the call that brought that news. So it just wouldn't have happened. It was completely good fortune.
It's a funny bit. I think we should just remind people, though, that the 24 hours before that, I thought, was going to be at least the most extraordinary, political debacle of the year, if not the decade, which was seeing 60 members of his government, starting with Sajid Javid, resigning, something none of us ever expected to witness with any prime minister. And yet that wasn't the most extreme or extraordinary, set of events of the year.
Yeah. I just remember that week not being able to remember who the Chancellor was, and I couldn't remember if Nazim Zahawi was still there or not.
So many of them.
Because Nazim Zahawi threatened to resign, but in my mind, because I'd listened to it first thing in the morning, I thought he had. Anyway, now, Robert, let's listen to one of your good bits. And actually, this is worth listening to in depth, because it's the pause when Liz Truss struggles to answer, and then what happens at the end when she walks off as well.
Robert Peston.
Prime Minister, the former Tory Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has just said that you have totally trashed the Tory party's election-winning reputation for economic competence. Will you apologise to your party?
Well, I am determined to deliver on what I set out when I campaigned to be party leader. We need to have a high growth economy, but we have to recognise that we are facing very difficult issues as a country. And it was right, in the national interest, that I made the decisions I've made today to restore that economic stability so we can deliver, first of all, helping people through this winter and next winter with their energy bills, but also making sure that our country is on the long-term footing for sustainable economic growth. Thank you very much, everybody.
Prime Minister, aren't you going to say sorry? Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, that was the press conference that for the last few people who had faith in Liz Truss, it basically dissipated after that, wasn't it?
I mean, my heart was slightly in my mouth, actually, with the sort of way that she answered. All of us at various times asked prime ministers and politicians if they were going to apologise to their party or the country. But I thought she was going to burst into tears. And it was, I just thought, oh my God, what have I done? and then, and we'd all been sitting there thinking, because this was a huge announcement. I mean, she'd sacked Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor. She had reversed a 20 billion effective tax cut because she said corporation tax was going to go up after all. And we all gathered in Downing Street, assuming we were going to get, a half-hour, 45-minute press conference. She was on for eight minutes. And after my question, visibly shaken, she walked off. And actually, interestingly, sort of talking to somebody very close to her only yesterday, because I actually recounted all this to him, and he said actually she had been in floods of tears shortly before the conference. Really? So in fact, the intuition of those of us in the room was not completely wrong about this.
And that was someone in a position to actually know.
Yeah, somebody was with her. Yeah, somebody was with her at the time, as it were. So so yeah, it was. One of the most. I mean, you were there. It was one of the most extraordinary press conferences. You were both there.
I mean, it was extraordinary. And the most incredible thing was how short it was.
I think it was 7 minutes 20. I mean, I was furious that day, as you know.
Well, because you can hear you at the end of that.
She didn't call me.
She didn't call you, did
so
she?
She took. I was, as Robert said, this had been a massive U-turn. She'd sacked her Chancellor. She was reversing her mini budget, and this was her moment to tell the country why she had done that and made a pitch for why she should stay on.
And take every question going.
She had a room full of journalists, and she took the Sun, the Telegraph. She took that. So she didn't. She took you, and then Robert was the final question, and then she walked off. And I remember, I'd formulated, carefully constructed a question, and I remember shouting as she left, are you out of your depth, Prime Minister, which was sort of the question that I wanted to ask. But I remember texting one of my editors after that, and I said, this is it. There's no way back.
I think we all knew. I think
everyone was agog in the room.
It was a question of whether it was a week or whether it was a few days, and it was very fast from that moment.
No, I remember one of our colleagues in the room ringing their news desk afterwards and saying she is. Insert word beginning with F.
Well, let's say toast.
Yeah.
We were in the front row, weren't we? And I remember she walked out, and we all kind of, you can't just go, you can't. And then I turned around, as you said, and all our colleagues, and everyone was just looking. Everyone was genuinely stunned. I mean, it was the most shocking press conference I'd ever been in, and it's so interesting that you say that now, Robert, because it explains quite a lot of what was going on for her, which was maybe it was just. She needed to extricate, it was too much.
Yeah, and I just wonder what are all the things that are big things facing the country that sort of no one has looked at because everyone's been consumed.
Well, I worry about. So it's not just in the country. We're not reporting very much on Afghanistan, where awful tragedies are going on. Extraordinary events in Iran that in a normal time would be leading the news every night are basically lucky to get on the news. I mean, there are big things that as news organisations are not getting on in the way that
even domestic policy that would normally be scrutinised.
One thing I'm quite excited about for next year, though,
to Adam, that says,
is to go back to the idea of actually looking at policy again. Because we've just done politics.
What's policy?
Look, you can take the bell out of the FT, Robert.
Exactly.
But the FT's always in there. But I'm quite looking forward to doing that. And also, for me, and I think for both of you, it's time to take a real look at Labour. Because if Labour are going to be in government...
But that's next year is... Because they look as though they're going to win, essentially, for the first time in years... what Labour now says really matters. And so you're right, there's a whole new strand of interesting and important stories, but they still will not sort of, the theatre.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. Thanks for keeping us company and for keeping us entertained and informed. I've got some presents for you.
Not only do we get to come on Newscast, but you give us
a present. Yeah, pass them along, one for each person.
Oh, that's so sweet.
And
Chris, you got one from me. Oh, thank you. Open them up. Well, listen to that beautiful radio sound effects.
Oh my God! All my Christmas dreams have come. Look at that.
I use stamina.
And I've got some beard oil and some tiny scissors.
Is
that a sign I should get rid of this?
That's so funny.
Oh, thank you.
Don't get rid of it.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, that was the highlight of my year, growing this. Anyway, thank you very much for everything. I hope you wear your T-shirts with pride over Christmas, whatever you're doing. And I seriously hope you get a good break, all three of you, because, I mean, we wouldn't survive as a country without you telling us what's going on. So,
Merry Christmas to all of you.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much for watching and for listening to Newscast. I'm desperate to take this Christmas jumper off because it's not got a lot of natural fibres, but while I'm doing that, I'm going to leave you with some more of the King's Singers singing the exclusive Newscast Christmas advert.
On the 12th day of Christmas, Newscast explained to me. 12 days at COP, 11 Tory leadership candidates, 10 hour plus queues to see the Queen. 9 interest rate rises, 8 billion humans, 7 weeks of trust, 6 by-elections, 5 education secretaries, 4 chancellors, 3 PMs, 2 heads of state, podcast on BBC. We clearly ooze stamina.